Don't you love trees? They're one of my favorite things to look at. I love the textures in the bark and all the different lines that the branches make. Hi, I'm Barry Techmeyer, and I'm a watercolor artist here in Kansas City. I'm getting ready to teach the class Watercolor and Ink, painting and sketching trees. So if you like trees as much as I do, I hope that you'll stick around, get that brush ready, because we're getting ready to paint and sketch some trees.
In this class, we're going to focus on the techniques and approaches needed to sketch and paint trees. We're going to learn to use wet into wet watercolor for foliage, and the splatter and wash urban sketching technique, as well as learning how to utilize trees in a composition without adding a lot of detail. So we've gone over the introduction, and now we have the class agenda and objectives. In the class itself, we're going to be talking about the supplies needed for activities, then using the sketch and wash and watercolor to create trees, creating line and wash tree drawing from observation, and then going into non-traditional tools that you might use. Our last activity will be creating a final painting, making a landscape with a tree as a center of interest, and then finally reviewing and wrapping up. When I get asked by my students what's the most important supply that I need to spend my money on, and it's your paper. Arches is a wonderful brand, and this is cold press, which means that it has a little bit of a bump to it. It's also 300 pound, which is very thick, and 100% cotton. Now let's talk palettes. This specific palette is the one that I use when I go out and do plein air painting, just because it's very small, plastic, it's lightweight, and the one thing I like about it is that it has this thumb hole. You can stick your thumb in and I can carry it like this very easily. The second palette is the one I actually started out with. This one is plastic and it has a lid. Same thing, it has nice areas to mix and it has plenty of areas for my paint. I like to take a marker and write down exactly what paint is in there so I'll know. And the lid comes back on nicely. And this is my favorite. This is a ceramic palette. This is the one I'm currently using. I like it because it's nice and big, has that central area that I can mix up colors in. I normally keep my warm colors on one side, my cool colors on the other side, and then my neutral colors up on the top. In order to remember what colors are where, I keep this chart. You can see I just write down what the paint is, because sometimes the colors are very close, and this way I can remember them. Next to paper, brushes are very important as well. This is the brand I like a lot. This is a silver black velvet. It's a number 10. Keep in mind that each company has their numbers and they each mean different sizes, but these are about a medium brush. And this is the company Princeton. This is a number 6 from Princeton. Both of these are called round brushes because of the brush part being round, and they both hold a point very nicely, which is very helpful when you're doing your painting. And this is a flat brush, also from the company Silver Black Velvet. It's called a flat brush because of the brush being flat at the top. They're usually measured by inches, and you'll see this is a 1/2 inch as far as the width is concerned. A flat brush is handy when you are painting large washes, as well as anything that is 1/2 inch in width. You can make a nice brush stroke with that. This is a faux squirrel mop brush. This is a number 14. It's able to have a nice point on the end. It's called a mop brush just because it holds so much paint. So it's great for painting large skies or anything else. Now let's talk sketchbooks. This is my favorite Etcher sketchbook. I've used it so much. I believe this one is cold press, which has a little bit bump to it. Again, you want to look at 100% cotton. I've used this for a lot of classes I've taught, so it's pretty full. And some of the trees I've painted here and done sketches with, and some buildings and things that I did when I was out plein air painting. But it's a great way to kind of keep everything in one area. And the nice thing about it is it will close up, and then it has this rubber band that clicks around so it doesn't open up on accident, and it just keeps things a little bit nicer. This is another Etcher sketchbook, and this one is a lot larger. This one's brand new. I just opened it up. Same thing, 100% cotton, and this is a cold press. You can also get hot press, which is much smoother than this. This is an example of how I tape up my watercolor paper. This is the tape that I use. It is a Scotch Blue brand, and I think this is much better than the regular artist tape because it pulls up without taking off some of the paper with it. I haven't talked about paint yet. Here is one kit that I have taken out and done plein air work with, and this happens to be a Winsor Newton kit. Has nice colors, a small brush in the middle, and a place for water in the center. And also, most of the time I use the tube paint. I don't use the watercolor kits as much as tube paint, just specifically because I can put out as much as I want, and also I can choose specifically the paints that I need. Now, in order to know what watercolors to get, when I'm talking about them in the video, I'm very specific about what colors I'm using. In this class, we're going to be using what's called a sketch and wash pencil. This is really nice because you can draw with it and then take water over the top of it, and it really looks like watercolor or ink when you're finished. I had heard one of my artist friends talk about his mechanical pencil, so I decided to go ahead and order one, and now that's all I use. Do you have to have a mechanical pencil? No. But they're nice to have when you're going out and drawing and sketching because you don't have to worry about sharpening it. The lead is automatically extended when you push the button on the end. And you can get several different types of lead as well. A couple more nice to haves, but you don't have to have, is a water brush. The nice thing about a water brush is the water is in the handle, so you don't have to worry about having a container if you're outside. The top screws off, and then you're able to use the brush on the end to activate your paint, and just take that and paint with it, and it's just very handy. The other thing you have is this is called a dip pen. It's what calligraphers use to make calligraphy, but we can use it, fill it with paint instead of ink, and it makes wonderful branches and great details. I get asked a lot about what kind of pens I use, and these Micron pens are probably the most reasonable, and they hold archival ink in them, so if you want to paint over the top of them, they don't smear. I've got a set of 10 and a set of 6, and you can see how much I use them. I keep in my backpack a lot. The sizes of the nibs go from like a 003 all the way up to like a positive 12, and lots of really great ways to use these.
We're going to be using a sketch and wash pencil, and with these pencils basically you just draw like regular pencils, and then you can take a brush with water on it and it's almost like painting. So starting with the first one, notice I'm holding my pencil kind of sideways. I'm going to show you a simple round tree. Now when I was teaching younger kids, they like to draw circles with just a line underneath it. So this is kind of in response to that, because there are a lot of trees that are rounded. I'm going to come over on this side and add a little bit of a shadow, because with our light coming from the left-hand side, this side is going to have a lot of shadow, a lot of light, and this side is going to have a lot of shadow. I'm going to press down pretty hard over here on this side, and then come down and add a little bit of a trunk and a shadow. Now, let me take my watercolor brush and dip it in the water
and show you how this works. It's really kind of nice. It adds a very nice texture. Almost has the impression of when you are using ink. So adding a little bit more texture in through here. And then coming down into my trunk. Adding a branch or two coming up there like that. And then my shadow. And there is my round tree. It's almost circular. Now let's go on and let's go to a tree that's kind of, I like to say it's a kind of jelly bean shape, but it's a spreading tree. Same situation, holding my pencil sideways. And you can see how I'm going to make it kind of a jelly bean shape, because what happens is these branches get very, very long. And so they kind of grow over where the main area would be. And my shadow on this side. Now in this one, since there's a lot of leaves on it, there's going to be some shadows underneath, and there'll probably be a few shadows in between some of the areas where there's a lot of growth. And my brush now, getting it wet, and coming in. Adding my texture, remembering where that highlight is coming from. Now tree number 3 is one that we're all familiar with, and it's a triangular tree, or pyramidal, and it's like an evergreen or a fir tree coming down like this. Sides are definitely jagged. Bottom is more rounded. We're not going to see the trunk as much. Now sometimes you would. Sometimes this bottom canopy part wouldn't come up down so far, so you're going to see the trunk. Now this is made up of a bunch of branches kind of sticking out like this. I'm going to make sure that I add some of that and come in like this as well. The texture is going to be just a little bit different than on the other trees. I believe this is called a conical tree. Add a little bit of a shadow over here. And a water. This side is definitely going to be darker. Tree number 4 is a tree that you might, as a shape that you might have if the tree has been shaped. And it reminds me basically of a corn dog. So it's kind of an oval shape like this. A shadow on the one side. Now some oval trees, again, maybe a little bit wider. Not this one. This one has more of that corn dog shape. Move this up a little bit so you can see it. So I'll get right in there, add my shadow. I really like using these sketch and wash. It also reminds me, sometimes when I'm doing some plein air work, I will work with an ink pen and water brush. It also reminds me of that technique. Very, very similar. Number 5 Number 5 sometimes is also the result of trees being trimmed. But I believe when I was out looking at trees and I was doing this, that this one was actually kind of a natural shape. It's kind of a vase shape. That's what I'm drawing here. It kind of looks like a piece of pizza almost. Just remembering our purpose for doing this, we are simplifying the shape. We're not necessarily looking at detail, and we're looking at how that shape takes on the shadow with our light coming from the left-hand side, so that when we do get into doing some watercolor trees, this will become more evident to us. Okay, we got one last one I want to show you, and this last one is an irregular tree. A lot of trees that haven't been trimmed or that you find out that are in the wild are going to be irregular, and they're basically made up of several different levels and several different layers of these irregular shapes. They are definitely not symmetrical. Some of these other trees you would find are symmetrical, where it's the same on both sides because they've been trimmed up to be that way. But this tree definitely is not. Also on this tree, in this specific one, there's going to be some branches that you're going to be able to see in between, because this is an open irregular tree as opposed to closed where this would all be together. Now each one of these sections is going to have the shadow on it individually, so I'll come in and put a little bit in there. Almost close to needing to having my pencil sharpened. Since that's the last one we're going to do here. And a little shadow, some texture. One thing that you need to remember as we're going through this, when you are painting trees, you don't necessarily want to add all the details. In this situation, this is a good situation where I am not coming in and adding a whole bunch of little leaves in through these areas, the same way when we're painting with watercolor. So I've mixed up two main colors. I've mixed up a light yellow, and I used Hourland and a little bit of Antwerp blue, and mixed up a lighter version up here with it's a yellow green and then a darker green. I'm going to use those as we start painting our trees. And thinking back to those shapes that we just talked about, I'm going to get some of the yellow green first and just start thinking about that shape on the rounded tree. Just come in here and start building up some foliage. Remembering the spacing in between, that this isn't a full tree. It's got a little bit of space in between some of the branches. Also remember what I mentioned about we're not trying to paint every little detail in here. We just are going for the main shape. Make sure this is nice and wet. Then I come in with the second part. This is my lighter value. Remembering where the light is coming from and where the shadows might be on this specific tree. Rinsing out my brush, drying it off, coming in and get some of that darker blue-green that I mixed up. And then I'm going to start putting in some shadows on this side, just kind of tapping them in. They're in there now. Don't have a whole bunch of water on my brush. I want to make sure that darker green is in some of those areas where the branches kind of get together there, those clusters. You can kind of see how that is coming together now, looking more three-dimensional. Down here on the bottom, like so. All right, then I'm going to rinse my brush out and dry it off. I'm going to see if there's any puddles of paint. I don't see any right now, but I'm going to start lifting up some of the lighter areas now. Just taking my brush, drying it off, and just rubbing it where some of those lighter sections might be, like right in through here. Some burnt umber mixed with a little bit of the ultramarine. And I'm going to come and just put in very carefully, put in a trunk in the bottom with a couple branches lifting up to that maybe. Starting up towards the top. Again, thinking about that shape. Rounded on the top. Maybe some leaves hanging over a little bit. This is a lot of leaves on it. Leaving some white spots of the paper showing through. So that would be like blank spaces within that tree. So thinking about the structure of this tree and looking at the details and seeing how each one is different. Now, we looked at some photographs as we were drawing the other one, so I really encourage you to look at the details of the tree and not just go by what you think it looks like, that we've talked about earlier. And that just helps it look so much more realistic, because again, every single tree is different. You don't have two trees that are the same. Okay. Wiping my brush off, and now I'm going to get some of that darker blue-green and do the same thing on this tree. So on this one, up a little bit, that's too wet. Make sure it's a thicker section of the paint that you're grabbing. You don't have too much water on it, because then it's going to get into some of the parts of the tree that you really don't want it to. It's going to be less controlled. Let that sit for just a second, and again, drying my brush off, I'm going to lift up on some of those lighter areas. This one's going to have more branches on it coming down this way. evergreen, you want to do kind of a bouncing method, just kind of back and forth a little bit, and think about those branches coming out. Now this is definitely, again, it's not a symmetrical tree, but you do want to think triangular. I'm kind of bouncing my brush coming down, and I'm going to do some lifting on this as well as I'm coming down. But think triangular. Those branches get longer as they come down farther this way, and then we'll add some detail, some of them hanging down too here. Alright, now I've got that. Let me go in and lift some of that color up on the lighter side. This trunk of a tree. Now the trunks on an evergreen tree are nice and tall and thin. And sometimes on these bottom branches, on the bottom trunk, you're going to have these little branches that kind of stick out a little bit, and you might see a couple of them up here too. After that dries, it's pretty dry, I can come in here and add a few more places where you're going to see the trunk of the tree going up.
To begin this process, I kept my eye out for a really knotty old tree that would be great to draw, and I found one at the lake that was not too far from my house. All the twisted branches and the wonderful textures on the bark. I went ahead and got it set up, including a nice comfortable lawn chair, as well as my GoPro and a nice something to drink. When you are starting, make sure you have your watercolor sketchbook as well as your ink pen and a pencil and eraser. I took a nice long look at the tree, noticing the shadows, noticing the textures, as well as how the branches are connected, and maybe some things I want to simplify to make it easier for me to draw. I started drawing in pencil, creating an outline of the tree, making sure to include the branches, and knowing and observing how they taper out. I'm mainly concerned with getting the main shapes, as well as some of the major lines that might be in the bark of the tree. What is there about this tree that makes it unique from all the other trees that are around it? What is the pattern or the rhythm that the branches make? Those are the things I want to keep in mind as I'm drawing. Once I finished with my pencil drawing, I started with my micron pen. This is an 03. I'm just basically outlining the areas first, and then if I see any knots or major textures I want to include as I'm going along, I'm putting those in as well. As I'm drawing on the lines and looking at the tree, I'm definitely noticing the shadows and where the light source is coming from. And if there's not a definite light source, you really need to choose one side or the other to make it more of an impact. I'm also emphasizing around the bottom of where the branch and the main part of the tree come together, because that's going to be kind of a rounded contour line that comes around, that contour hatching we talked about in class. Most of the tree I decided to just do with hatching. Repeated hatching over and over again to create those shadows. To create the shadows, you're going to put them one right after the other fairly closely, again, not overlapping at first. The closer they are together, the darker the shadow is going to be. Sometimes when I was working on the tree, I just decided to draw some random lines. And that basically helped with some of the textures that are on the bark, because they weren't exactly straight, but they definitely had a bunch of texture. Another technique that's important for you to utilize on your tree is that contour curved line. It's like the hatching, but only it goes along with the contour of the tree. I used it where the branches meet the main part of the tree or the trunk, and I also used it on some of the branches that were farther up and that were more shadowed. Before I started painting, I mixed up a gray using burnt sienna and a little bit of cerulean blue. Now you wouldn't have to use those two colors, but you do want to start probably with a cooler gray color. I'm splattering it onto the paper because we're going to take these splatters. Not only does it add a nice texture, but we're going to use the splatters to paint with. Now that I've got the first group of splatters on my tree, I'm just taking a wet paintbrush. Now, not a really, really wet paintbrush. Wipe it off before you start doing this, almost just to be damp. And you're just going to start brushing over the top of your tree to kind of mix those colors together and make a nice base color, kind of an underpainting to put on the tree. I'm then taking some burnt sienna and I want to make that color warmer, make the tree a little bit warmer, and also to have a brown tone to it. So I paint that over some of the branches that didn't get very much paint the first time. It's really important to emphasize the shadows. So on this tree there's a warm side and then there's a cool side. The warm side where the light source is hitting it, and then the cool side obviously is going to be where the shadows are. So taking that blue and I am just going to brush it over some of those shadowed areas. I decided that I wanted a touch of green in the background, so I got some of the Viridian and mixed it up with a little bit of the gray. I'm going to splatter this in the background as well, because you can't have enough splatters, you know. In finishing up, there's a couple things I want you to notice. First of all, the paint is very transparent, so remember to use lots of water when you're mixing up your colors. And second, the paint does not cover up the wonderful detail created by your ink pen. So with non-traditional painting tools, I'm talking about tools other than a paintbrush that you would use to take paint from your palette onto your paper that you're painting. We're going to start out with a water brush. Now, water brushes are pretty popular, but I actually did not start using a water brush until I started doing some plein air work. That would be work outside. They're mainly for convenience in that you don't have to take water with you, but they spread out paint just as nicely as a regular brush would. The dip pen is basically just taking a calligraphy pen with a nib and utilizing it for paint instead of for ink. This is something that I discovered probably about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's fantastic to utilize for hatching and cross-hatching and doing some detail work that you would normally do with pen and ink, but we're doing it with watercolor instead. A scrap piece of watercolor paper is something that everybody can have, because if you're painting, you obviously are going to have some scraps laying around. And this is great for if you're going to be painting aspen or a birch tree, where there is some definite texture on the bark of the tree that you want to create. And this is a simple way of doing it, just taking your paper and dipping it into the paint and then dragging it across. You can also take your paper and use the edge of it to create the branches. One good way to create more texture is simply to take your paper and drag it across instead of up and down. So that would be horizontally instead of vertically, to get a nice texture going across that way. Because most aspen trees or birch trees have that wonderful black and white texture that comes across on the side. A non-traditional tool that I use to get grasses And some textures in the ground is a rope brush. This is simply just a piece of rope that I have cut up and tied it together in the middle. And what I do is dipping that in the paint and then dragging it up in a vertical fashion like this. You can get some nice textures for some grass. Something we all have laying around in our yards at this time of year would be a twig. You want one that's going to give you a lack of control when you dip it into paint and then put it on the paper. And you can see here the twig is making the decisions as far as how the branch is created. Now the good thing about this is with you losing control, the twig allows to make the branches more natural looking with lots of curves and lots of different places on it to make it look like the branches on a tree would. And while you're out there in your yard, go ahead and grab a stick that you can sharpen, either in a pencil sharpener or you can also use a knife. And this is great for drawing. And I dip it right into the paint, and you can utilize this just like you would pen and ink. And taking it and using hash marks and cross hatch marks, and you can do this with any color that you would like. But this also creates some really wonderful textures as you're working on with the stick onto the paper. Another way to create texture on the paper itself while you're creating your painting is simply to take an old toothbrush and dip it into the paint and then use your fingers to splatter it like this. Now I've also taken a brush and gotten it wet just with water and ran it through that paint, and once again that's another way to make some really nice grasses on the bottom. Before you start a landscape, the first thing you need to do is to find a resource photo. This can be a photograph that you've taken, like this one, which was taken on Pikes Peak in Colorado, or you can get online and do a search for a photograph as long as it's free. When you're looking for a photograph, you want to find one that has a good composition and has a variety of textures. In this specific case, I have a nice large sky with some clouds, plenty of trees to paint, as well as the nice textures in the ground where the rocks are and some grass. In my classes, I always teach my students about composition, specifically the rule of thirds. If you're a photographer, this is not new to you. If you look at the photograph, you can see that I've placed red lines and divided it up into 3 sections vertically and 3 sections horizontally. Where the lines intersect is where you want your center of interest to be. In this specific case, I noticed that the tall tree that's on the left-hand side would be great for my center of interest. However, I would need to move it over to the right so that it lands on the red line. That way the composition will be better. For this painting, I'm using a postcard size piece of watercolor paper, and I've taped it down to my watercolor board. And I'm using my pencil and just sketching out some of the main lines where the horizon line is, as well as where I want the trees to be, and then where some of the rocks are surrounding the trees. And as we start painting, we're going to start with the sky first. So I'm getting my brush wet. And this is my mop brush that I've used. It's a very thick brush that holds a lot of water. And for this technique, what I'm going to be doing is I'm only going to be painting water where the clouds are. And then I will be painting the blue around the outside. I'm getting some cerulean blue from my palette, and I want to make sure that I am getting it a milk consistency where it is not too thick, but it's not real watery either. I'm taking that now and making sure that I've got a good color. So I've got a piece of scrap paper and checking the color on it, making sure it's light enough, and it is. I will be adding probably several layers of this in some situations. So here I am going around where the clouds are, and what happens is, since the water is there on the paper already, the paint will go into the clouds and make the edges nice and fuzzy, so that as the paint granulates, it creates the clouds and makes them look great. This is a wet on wet technique that I use a lot when I'm doing plein air work and also for smaller paintings. The bottoms of the clouds always have a shadow. So I'm taking just a little bit of what's called neutral tint. It's a gray, and you can see it's a very, very light gray because I've added lots of water to it. Once again, this is milk consistency. And I'm holding my paintbrush sideways, and I'm just barely putting a little bit of the shadow on the bottom of the clouds. These are not storm clouds, so I don't want it to be too dark. Then I'm taking my paintbrush, this is a dry paintbrush, and just getting it damp and softening the edges so that there's not any sharp edges. We want these to look soft like clouds. And then once I have that done, I'm getting a stronger cerulean blue, and I'm going to add some more blue in there. And then I'm going to take my mister and just mist it just a little bit, and that's going to add that contrast that we need. And you can see how that blue is just gradiating out as it goes. Taking my brush again, soaking up some of the puddles and drying it off. After my sky is dry, then I'm ready to start working on the rocky ground. I've taken burnt sienna, quinacridone gold, and just a little bit of neutral tint and mixed it together to create a base color. We call this an underpainting in watercolor. Then I'm coming in and creating some texture. Taking ultramarine, Hansa yellow medium, it could be actually any yellow, and then also taking a little bit of cadmium red, and that's going to dull down the green to make it a darker green. The The next technique I want to show you is how you create trees that are in the distance. Right now I'm taking my round brush and I'm wetting the area where the trees would be. Keep in mind that this is going to be a wet on wet process, so we want to keep that area pretty wet before we put paint on it. Now we're creating a background green, and it's with ultramarine yellow again and the cadmium red. And I'm looking at my photograph to see how the trees are varied sizes, varied heights, and just letting that paint soak into the paper. Now that that is completely dry, I'm ready to start using my rigger brush. That's a really thin brush. It's also called a liner brush. And I'm going to start painting the trees that are in the middle ground and in the foreground. Using the liner brush allows you to start adding a little bit of detail to what you're painting. Look specifically at where the branches are and how they're formed. Remember, this is a triangular tree. Also remember, it has the sky through those branches, so it's not going to be completely full. It is not symmetrical, meaning that the branches on one side are not going to be exactly the same as those that are on the other side. Be sure to look at your resource photo and get ideas as far as how this is going to be painted. Take your time, go slowly, and remember the texture that is created by each branch as you paint it. The key to successful painting in this situation is you start out with that lightest value to create the underpainting, let it dry, and then you're going to add another glaze or paint on top of it that's just a little bit darker. Now when I'm doing the details here that are the rocks and things, then I go with my darkest value of that brown that we mixed up for the texture. Having all three values, the lightest value, the medium value, and then the darkest value, really creates the depth that you're looking for. The other thing that helps is utilizing your brush properly. Having the brush sideways to show the texture that's on the paper, and utilizing that texture, as well as using the point when you're putting in some details. An easy way to create some texture is to pick up the toothbrush and to splatter a little bit of paint onto the paper. Now you have to be careful to control this because it can go anywhere. But the good thing is if you have too much splatter in an area, you can always take a wet paintbrush and lift up that color. But it creates a really nice rocky texture that you can emphasize with even darker color if you need to. As I'm finishing up, you should be able to see the foreground, which is the darker values, and the rock, the detail that's there. The middle ground, which are the lighter trees, and the background, which is the lightest trees in the very background that we painted. And the one tree that we created as our center of interest. It's darker and closer than the others. So let's wrap up our class by answering some questions. I have 4 questions for you. First of all, what are the vertical and curved lines called that create shading? Second, what 2 types of colors should I mix up prior to painting leaves on the trees? Third, what is the composition method that we use to create a landscape called? And finally, how can you create a center of interest in a painting? So let's look at some of the answers to our questions. First of all, the vertical and curved lines are called hatching. Sometimes they're cross-hatching when there's 2 of them. The 2 types of colors that you use are light green and dark green. That doesn't mean you can only use those colors. Those are the 2 I used in the painting. The composition method is called the rule of thirds. And finally, how can you create a center of interest? You can place the items on one of the cross marks in the rule of thirds. You can make it larger than any of the items, and you can also create more details. Now, these are not the only ways to create a center of interest, but these are 3 that I mentioned in the video. I hope that you've enjoyed our class. Get those paints ready and start painting.